Hey everyone! In this tutorial I will show you how to add a new stat to the Dungeon Crawler toolkit. So more specifically, I want to show you how to add the food stat. And this is a common stat in these sorts of Dungeon Crawler games, where every step that you move, the food value is decreased and you can increase it by eating. So if you keep an eye on this food stat as I move, it will decrease quickly in this case, and when it is 0 and we move, you can see that this elf will start to take damage. But if we pick up one of these food items, and then again keep an eye here, we can consume it to increase food, and then when we move it will start decreasing again. So this will be shown as an example stat that you can add, but it will serve as a general example of how to extend the functionality of this toolkit by adding your own stats. Okay, so let's get started. So here I am in the dungeon map. Doesn't really matter where you are at this point, but go to the data folder and you will find DT Stats, which holds all of the stats that are used. And here we want to add two new stats. Let's add them like this, and we'll call the first one food and the second one hunger. So food will determine how function as sort of a health bar, and when it reaches 0 then we start taking damage, while hunger that tells us how much food will increase for each step that we take. So we need this to have a tag so that it shows up in our tag table, and so we preface this with stat and then use the same food for this, and then stat hunger for this. There. Okay, let's save. And next we want to make sure that we can see our food stat on the HUD. So if we go back to Dungeon and User Interface, we can find the Stats widget blueprint here. Here you can see all of the stats. So we have the primary stats, so by default these are the stats that can be increased with ability points, and the derived stats, which are the ones that depend on the primary stats, or depend on other stuff but cannot be increased directly. So I think it makes sense to make our food stat one of these. So let's duplicate one of these stat lines, and then we can rename this to stat line food. And then in the stat tag here we should be able to choose food or hunger. Let's choose food. We don't need to show both necessarily. And there we have our new stat. So now if we go and play our game, we will see that in the stats tab we have our new stat. But I mean, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't interface with anything, it doesn't have a value or anything. So first we need to make sure that this food stat can be increased or decreased based on the character that we have. So let's say if I want to have the maximum value of food be dependent on the character's race. So we can go to the data tables here and find DT races, and then we can add new stats. So here we have our default for races. So let's add food stats to all of these, like 50 for humans, say, and the Cyclops can have higher, like starting at 100. Dwarf makes sense, like 80, and elves don't have much of a stomach, so let's put this at 30. And there we have some default food values. If we hit play now, you will notice that food will still be set at 0, because we need to define this in the rules of our game that we are actually using this stat. This is for modularity, where you can swap out the game instance to change what stats are used. So here we have the stat tags within BPGI Dungeon, the game instance, which can be found in the core blueprints here. And in the stat tags, you can edit this, and then we want to add our food and hunger stats. So now they will be used for our game. So if we now hit play, you will see that we have our food values based on our races of the starting characters here. But I said that I also wanted food to be dependent on the constitution stat of the character. So we can make this a true derived stat by going to data, and we can find our derived stats data table here. And here you can see what stats are derived from other stats. So in this case, we already have an entry for constitution. You don't need to have more for the same ability or the same stat. So here we have constitution, and we can see that health is derived from constitution, and that for every point we put into constitution, we get 5 more health. But we also want to now increase our food, so we can add an element here. And here we choose the stat food, and we choose a value. So say we can have this at 10. So 10 times the constitution stat will be our food stat plus what we have from our race. And then we choose a curve. So this is a curve that defines when you increase the base stat by this amount, how does this relate to the increase in the derived stats. So you can use different kinds of curves for this to have different increases depending. So you can get, let's say, if you have the more you have in the base stat, the greater the increase becomes for each successive increase. This can make sense for stuff like experience, say, and leveling up, where each level requires more experience. But in this case, we want to have a simple one-to-one relationship here. So using the same curve steps float here is a good one, because this is the one, this curve is based on steps. I can show how it looks here. So it has steps, so it goes like this. So when you increase one stat, the derived stat does not increase at all until you have increased a whole point, and then the derived stat increases by 1 whole point, and so on. So for stuff where we don't want to have values in between whole numbers, then that is a good choice. So let's choose the same one, steps, curve steps float, increased by 10. And if we now hit play, we will see that our food stat is much higher based on the constitution. And if we increase constitution, we will see that food increases by 10 points each time we increase constitution by 1 point. So we have our food stat, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't decrease ever. It's just a static number that does nothing. So let's implement hunger. So we will have a hunger value where every step that we take in our dungeon, it increases our food by that amount. And hunger also maybe makes sense to depend on our race. So if we go to our data and our races, and then we can find them here. Actually, let's just let the food value be entirely dependent on constitution. So we'll just switch this over to hunger, and we'll say that humans, for every step that they take, they lose 10, and cyclopses, for every move they make, they lose 20, and dwarves, for every step they lose 5 points of food, and elves, every step they lose 50, because elf needs food. So where do we implement this logic? Well, luckily we already have stepwise increases in health when moving, so we can use the same code for this. So if we go to our core blueprints, you will find the player character, and within the player character we can find in the event graph here, you can see that there's a step event. So at the start of the game, this event is bound to an event in the dungeon pawn reference. So every time we take a step, you will see in the dungeon pawn here that, let's see, when they take a move step, they will call, or where is it called? Let's see, on step end. Yeah, it's here. So when this lure pair from move steps is finished, then it calls this event dispatcher. And we bind at the start of the game this event dispatcher to this event, so every time our dungeon pawn takes a step for each of our player characters, they will, if they're not dead, increase their health by a set amount. We can apply the same logic for our hunger. So let's use a modify stat here. So every step we modify our food stats. We can choose that here, and we want to modify it by our hunger. So if we then get the stat value of hunger, and we don't want to use the base stat, you could use that because if you will never modify your hunger stat, but if you can get an enchanted hunger stat, say, then you want to use the derived stat. So we just use the derived stat here, which will be the same as the base stat if this ability is not enchanted or modified in some way. So we want to modify our food stat by our hunger stat. We want this to be a subtraction. And we want to update the derived stats, though food doesn't have any derived stats, so we could keep this at false. But if we ever want to have another stat that depends on our food value again, we can add another derived stat in our derived stats data table. So let's just keep this checked, and it cannot be negative. We don't want to have a food stat value that is below 0. So let's see if this works. If we hit play and we keep an eye on our stats, our food stat, and we move, you will see that it increases for every step. Elf is already at 0, and they're losing this quite quickly. Of course, for testing purposes, you wouldn't want to have it be this extreme in an actual game, but this is fine for now. Okay, so let's make it so that when food is at 0 and you take another step, then your health is decreased. So if we go back to the player character, we have another function we can look at here, which is run effects following stat change. So whenever a stat is changed, this function is called to see if there are any effects that we want to run. So here is a switch on the stat, so we can run various logic depending on what stat has been modified. So we add a new stat here, add this pin, and we can choose food. So if our food stat has been modified, then we want to check, get the stat value of food, and if this stat is 0 or lower, it should never be lower, but just in case. So if it's 0 or lower, then we want to deal damage to this character. We could use the modify stat here, but we have a specific function for this as well, which is the deal damage, or is it take damage? Yeah, that's the one. And we want to take a certain amount of damage. We can just hard code it for now. You would probably want to have this stored in a variable, and then just to keep this proper, any function should end with a return node, and there. So let's see if this works. If we go back to our dungeon and hit play, and we check the elf, and we move, now it's 50, health is fine. Now we move again, now he takes damage. For every step the elf takes damage, and now he's dead and he stops taking damage. But yeah, our Cyclops is already hungry, so this seems to be working fine, but this will be a difficult game to play unless we have some way of replenishing our food stat. So let's add a new item for that, a consumable item that we can eat to increase food. So if you have not seen it already, check out my tutorial video on adding items, because we're going to do that quickly now. So let's go to our data table for items, and I'm not going to bother adding a new mesh or a new icon for this. So let's just base this on the mana potion. We can duplicate it, and let's call this protein shake. And this is consumable. We can keep the flavor text, and let's call it protein shake like this. And for this we want to increase our food stat when this is consumed. We can just use the effect blueprint for the healing potion here, because it's set up to automatically heal any stat that is added in the effect stats, as I explained in the item video. So now we have our food consumable item. We can add one of these to our level. Let's place it on this barrel here. So take this item, and we take a protein shake, and we add a couple of those. And now if we hit play, oh, Elf's gonna die before we reach it. But yeah, there are shakes. Let's move a bit more until we have no food. We start taking damage. But then keep an eye on the food here. When we consume this item, food increases. And now again the Cyclops can move, at least briefly, without taking damage. Great! So I hope that was helpful in explaining a bit about how stats work and how you can add new stats and use them in various ways. If you have any questions, then as always you can ask me in the support thread on the Unreal Engine forums, especially for longer questions. You can hit me up on Discord, or you can ask in the comments below if there's something pertaining specifically to this video. So that's it for now. See you in the next one.